For far too long, we've been given a prescription for living by our politicians that has made us unhealthy as a nation and as a people. I hope to offer you a doctor's prescription for living that's completely different from what our politicians prescribe. If you embrace this way of living, you'll find that your life will be happier, healthier, wealthier, more engaging, and simply better. In part 1 of this 3-part series, you'll come to understand just how sick we've become in America and increasingly abroad. In 2016, a group of researchers from Oregon State University asked a question: what percentage of Americans adhere to the following 4 healthy living habits? They exercise regularly, they consume a nourishing, healthy diet, they maintain a normal body weight, and they did not smoke. What percentage of people in this very large study of over 10,000 people do you think met all 4 of these healthy living criteria? Almost everyone overestimates the answer. The actual answer is a shockingly low 2.7%. That should tell us that there is something very wrong with our modern way of living. As a species, we Homo sapiens have been roaming the earth for about 300,000 years. For well over 95% of that time, we have lived as hunter-gatherers. We lived largely as farmers for about 2 to 3% of our time on Earth, and the post-industrial era in which we now live comprises only about 0.1% of our time as a species. In other words, for 99.9% of our time, we were not accustomed to living the way we do today. Now, let's think how well our hunter-gatherer ancestors met those same 4 healthy living criteria we talked about above. What percentage of them exercised regularly? As you might guess, nearly 100%. What percentage of them consumed healthy, nutritious food? Well, in those times, food was nutritious in the sense that it was not processed. But food was also scarce, so starvation was a real threat. Thus, even though very few people back in those days were overweight or obese, being underweight was a real problem because, again, starvation was a real threat for that time. Finally, smoking came into existence only after we settled down as farmers, so no one really smoked in those days. The point is that for well over 99% of our time on Earth, we were able to easily meet all 4 of those criteria unless food was in short supply. This is not to suggest that we should go back to living as hunter-gatherers. No, really what this tells us is that if it was so easy for our forefathers to meet these criteria when food was available, then for us, when in fact food is available, we should be able to easily meet these healthy living criteria. But in fact, we do not. And so that tells us once again that there is something really wrong with our modern way of living, and it has some serious implications for our health. First, here we see that among wealthy nations, the United States has the lowest life expectancy, marked by the blue line at the very bottom. And here we see that Americans have the highest rates of obesity. In fact, excluding small nations of less than 5 million population, the United States has the highest rates of obesity worldwide. Even worse, rates of obesity are increasing over time everywhere. And so what this tells us is that it's not just a problem that we in America are dealing with, but in fact every nation worldwide is dealing with the same issue. Let's look at the prevalence of chronic diseases in our current age compared to those of our ancestors before the Industrial Revolution. What you'll notice is that across a range of chronic diseases, anything from major depressive disorder, Alzheimer's, colon cancer, diabetes, and all these chronic diseases, they are higher in prevalence today than they ever were in the pre-industrial times. Some of these diseases didn't even exist in those days. And by the way, this is not an exhaustive list. there are several other diseases that are also higher in prevalence today than they were in previous times. If you look at chronic diseases as a whole, we in the United States are suffering from a higher burden of chronic disease than any other industrialized nation on earth. Similarly, if you look at rates of diabetes, again, over time, it's only increasing. Diabetes is in fact tenfold more common today than it was just 100 years ago. Once again, we're failing to contain the diseases that we didn't even have just 100 years ago. Now, you could say, well, wait a minute. We did overcome a lot of infectious diseases like smallpox and malaria and tuberculosis, and those were major killers in the 20th century. Today, tuberculosis is much less common in America, and smallpox has been completely eradicated. And that is true. But what has happened is that we've graduated from these diseases of lower income, or the disease of poverty, to the diseases of the rich world. Over time, in fact, if you look across the map, what you'll see is that poorer countries, as they become wealthier, overcome infectious diseases only to then develop all the chronic diseases as we ourselves have. And so once again, that illustrates the point that there is something very wrong going on here. Why can't we take the good without also taking the bad? Why can't we overcome infectious diseases without then graduating to develop chronic diseases? There is a better way. In part 2 of our video series, we're going to find out the reason we're seeing a high prevalence of chronic disease. In other words, we're going to learn the diagnosis for what ails us.